Tulsi Gabbard is the 2020 presidential election's most misunderstood candidate. Some fear her, others revere her, and some even loathe her. But why? What is it about Tulsi Gabbard that makes her so controversial? By all accounts, Gabbard seems like the Democratic ticket dream. She's young, she's a woman of color, she's a religious minority. Though she's only in her late 30s, she has more experience in government than some of her much older peers. Tulsi was first elected to the Hawaii State Legislature when she was only 21 years old. She has since also served in the Honolulu City Council as a legislative aide for a U.S. senator and now as an elected member of Congress since 2013. And if all of this weren't enough, Tulsi is also currently serving as a major in the Hawaii Army National Guard and has even been deployed to the Middle East twice. So what's the problem? Well, long story short, Gabbard's got a mind of her own. I had the opportunity to catch up with Tulsi on the campaign trail, and over the course of 2 days, sat down with the candidate to figure out what exactly is it that makes her tick.
Why are you running? Why do this? This is a huge job. There's a lot that goes into it. They say all your hair will go white when it's all done. So why are you running?
As a soldier, I've served for almost 15 years in the Army National Guard. In Congress, I have served for over 6 years on the Foreign Affairs and the Armed Services Committees. In the Army National Guard, deployed twice to the Middle East. I know firsthand the cost of war and who pays the price. I am committed as President, as Commander-in-Chief, to ending these wasteful regime change wars that have caused suffering not only for our troops, our veterans, their families, the American people, but for the people in the countries where we wage these wars. They have undermined our national security, strengthening terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they have taken trillions of dollars out of our pockets, out of the pockets of the American people, dollars that should be spent on serving the needs of our people, the very real and urgent needs.
That's a big undertaking.
It is, but it is central. It is central to all of these other challenges and needs that the people across this country have.
Yeah.
You know, as we talk about health care for all, we talk about education, the need to invest in infrastructure, to address climate change. Unless we deal with this central issue of the cost of war, deal with the central issue of where trillions of our taxpayer dollars are going towards these wasteful regime change wars, this nuclear arms race, then we will not have the resources to be able to pay for the things that people need.
So just what are her priorities and vision for America?
I support Medicare for all, because it addresses the root cause of this issue, which is we have far too many people in this country who aren't able to get the care that they need. I think we have nearly 30 million people today who don't have any kind of health insurance at all. I think it's nearly 80 million people who are underinsured, meaning they might have some kind of coverage, but they're not able to afford to actually get the care they need because of high out-of-pocket expenses or high deductibles. Medicare for All provides that quality coverage, that quality care for everyone.
Okay. Universal education? How do you feel about that? I mean, I know that you have, you're a co-sponsor of the College for All Act, is that right?
Yeah.
So this was a legislation that anybody under a household income of $125,000 would get higher education.
Yeah. Higher education, this can be from a public institution, can be workforce training, vocational training, basically to say, hey, we've got to best equip our young people, set them up for success in whatever path that they choose in their lives.
Now, the Green New Deal is what everybody's talking about, but you've actually proposed legislation that's a bit more aggressive, the Off Fossil Fuels Act. Can you tell us what the differences are between those two?
Well, the legislation that I've put forward is very specific. It's an actionable plan, and I think that's what we need to focus on right now. Given the urgency of this climate crisis that we're facing, we have to put forward a plan that we can implement on how to get our country off of this dependence on fossil fuels and make the kinds of bold investments in green renewable energy, in a green economy, green jobs, really set us up for success for the future. We also need to address agriculture in this country and how our agriculture practices, much of which have been subsidized by the federal government with a lot of support going to these multinational agribusinesses who are really taking advantage of our soil and whose practices are emitting more carbon into the atmosphere, making this exacerbating the climate crisis that we're facing. And lastly, I'll say this is another reason among many why we have to have relationships built on cooperation with other countries rather than conflict, because even if we did absolutely every single thing we possibly could in this country as quickly as possible, it still would not be enough to address this climate change challenge that is not only posed to us, but to the world. So we've got to be able to work with other countries, because we've got to collectively make this change to impact our future.
You went to North Dakota. You stood with Standing Rock.
Yeah.
You also traveled to Flint. You also are a co-sponsor of the Water Act. So water is something that's very dear to you. Water is life. Right?
Water is life.
Yes. So one thing that I find really alarming that is happening, a trend, is the commoditization of water.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on this? Is this something that people should be able to make money off of?
No. I mean, water is life.
Yeah.
We have to understand and recognize this. We can't think about any other issue unless we have clean water. Every person needs to be able to have clean water. This is what's so heartbreaking about the current situation that we're in, where our water is being threatened by corporate interests, like in places like Standing Rock, where you have people in cities like Flint in Michigan whose lives and well-being and their children's health is being threatened and poisoned because of the decision of some self-serving politicians in that state who poison their water because of the lack of investment in resources.
Yeah, it's amazing that they still don't have clean water.
Exactly.
I mean, it's amazing.
Years later.
Yeah. Gabbard doesn't take PAC money. She's for the decriminalization of marijuana and recently even introduced legislation to end the prohibition on the use of the recreational and medicinal drug. She's also co-sponsored reparations legislation for descendants of slaves and recently introduced legislation to protect our elections from cyber hackers.
The real threat to our democracy that we're facing right now is the vulnerabilities that exist within our elections infrastructure. That we don't have a secure election system in this country. We shouldn't pretend that we do. And this is something that Congress needs to take action to address immediately, to make sure that the votes that we cast in 2020 are not called into question.
Right.
You imagine the kind of crisis that would cause. The reality is there are many states in this country that are very vulnerable to hacking, where whether it's an individual or a foreign country or rogue actor could come in and literally change the votes that we cast, change the outcome of our election. Very simply, my bill says that every single state will have paper ballots or a voter-verified paper backup if they're using an electronic system, so that 100% we have an auditable paper trail to make sure that if there are some issues or questions raised, that you're able to go back and audit and verify every single one of those votes cast with that paper trail.
Though Tulsi has a robust and very progressive domestic platform, it's clear it was her time away at war that has shaped who she is today and her passion for ending regime change wars. You definitely have stated numerous times you want to end regime change wars, that you yourself have seen the actual cost of war. If you're comfortable, can you, what did you see?
Well, first of all, I'm still a soldier in the Army National Guard, currently serving as a major. Deployed twice to the Middle East, and the first deployment was to Iraq, where I served in a medical unit. We were in a camp for about a year, 40 miles north of Baghdad. It was in what at that time they called the Sunni Triangle, which was a very, it was a hot period of the war during that time, and there were a lot of casualties. And the very first thing that I did every day, the very first thing was to go through a list of names of every single service member in the country of Iraq who was a casualty in the previous 24 hours. And to go through that list of names to see if there were any of the soldiers from our brigade, which had almost 3,000 soldiers there operating in 4 different parts of Iraq, and to see if they had been hurt, were they getting the care that they needed there in country, what was their status, and if they needed to be evacuated, making sure that they got evacuated as quickly as possible, either to Germany or back to the United States. And it was heart-wrenching every single day, knowing who's paying the price
who's paying the price for this regime change war? And knowing that behind every one of those names, yes, was a service member, was also their loved ones at home, worried, sick, afraid, anxious that they might get that phone call that no one ever wants to get. Knowing that these are the people who would continue to pay the price for this regime change war long after they go home. I wondered then, as I went through this every single day, if there were politicians in Washington who ever laid awake at night, worried and stressed and thinking about the names and the faces of these service members and their families who were directly impacted by their vote or their decision to wage this regime change war. A war that caused great suffering for our troops and our veterans, great suffering and death in the Iraqi people. Lost many of my brothers and sisters in uniform who paid the ultimate price there. Strengthened and brought the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And a war that cost us so much money, trillions of dollars that came out of our pockets, dollars that are not being used to serve the needs of the people here at home.
Does it scare you a little bit that, as a service member, that so many of the candidates have never served?
It concerns me deeply because too often what we have seen are one of two things. When you have a president who comes in without that depth of understanding or personal experience, is they either come in and are surrounded by, whether they are neocon or neo-lib war hawks in the foreign policy establishment, who continue to perpetuate these same failed policies, these same costly policies that lead us into these wasteful regime change wars. Or you have the second thing, is someone who's coming in without that experience and that knowledge and understanding and foresight, who then feels like they need to exude strength. Mm-hmm. They need to prove themselves somehow, and too often the way that they do that is to say, hey, I need to prove that I'm strong. I'm going to go and launch our military. I'm going to go drop some bombs in another country to prove to who exactly that they have the strength and courage to be commander-in-chief, when in fact all they're doing is dishonoring our troops by sending them on missions that are not worthy of their sacrifice, causing more suffering for people in other countries, and undermining our own country's interests.
Though Tulsi Gabbard has made it clear she wants to end regime change wars, this doesn't mean she's a pacifist.
I'm not a pacifist. I'm a soldier.
Okay.
I'm a soldier who took a promise, who took an oath, swearing to uphold and protect the people of this country, to serve our country, and I'm willing to put my life on the line to do so, to go after and to take out those who seek to do us harm.
And again, though Gabbard is against regime change wars, this doesn't mean she's against all wars.
You definitely feel strongly about sending our troops off to battle for regime change wars, that it's clearly an unnecessary cost, often of which is their life. Are you against all wars?
Look, wars are terrible. Unfortunately, they're sometimes necessary to keep our people safe. This is the reality of the world that we live in, and we have to look at this world as it exists rather than try to exist in a world that doesn't. So the reality is there are those who seek to do us harm. Unfortunately, war is sometimes necessary. We have to have a trained and capable, ready military that's focused on fulfilling that mission of keeping our country, keeping our people safe. This is one of the reasons why I am so committed to ending these wasteful regime change wars, because they are so counter to that mission of they undermine our national security. They put our troops' lives at risk. They cause more suffering for the people in the countries where we wage these wars, and they take trillions of our limited taxpayer dollars away from things that they should be focused on addressing here at home.
In fact, the U.S. has repeatedly allied with and armed the very terrorists we claim we're trying to defeat in order to pull off these various regime change wars. Gabbard wants to end all of that.
Which wars would you say are regime change? So Iraq, obviously.
Iraq, obviously,
Yeah.
Going in and toppling Saddam Hussein. Libya, going in and toppling Gaddafi. And the regime change war in Syria, seeking to try to overthrow the Assad government.
This desire has led her down a path of making a series of decisions that have left a slew of enemies in her wake. In 2016, Gabbard stepped down as the DNC vice chair to endorse Bernie Sanders after realizing Hillary Clinton was likely to continue the U.S. regime change war problem. This move left her with many enemies inside the Democratic establishment. She then outdid herself in 2017 when she traveled to Syria on a fact-finding mission, fearing our nation was once again about to be marched into another regime change effort. While there, the Congresswoman accepted an invitation to meet with Bashar al-Assad, a decision that was heavily criticized. Many wondered why she would accept an invite from someone the world views as a brutal dictator.
You met with Assad, and you also met with the opposition. You've met with Modi. You've met with his opposition.
Yep.
You've met with Palestinian officials and Israeli officials. You're one of the few, I feel like, that's actually willing to meet with a variety of people on both sides of different issues. There have been leaders in our nation's history that have had to make tough decisions on who they've met with, like Hoover met with Hitler, FDR met with Stalin.
JFK with Khrushchev.
Yeah. So is there a leader you would not meet with?
No. And here's why. If we are serious about the pursuit of peace and security, we have to be willing to take those meetings, to have those tough conversations, whether they are with adversaries or potential adversaries or brutal dictators, because the only alternative to having those meetings is war.
And that's actually been our U.S. foreign policy for several decades. The various presidential administrations have found ways to talk the American people into supporting these regime change efforts, whether it be the Soviet Red Scare, weapons of mass destruction, the use of chemical weapons, or socialism. The powers that be not only encourage, but applaud these efforts.
When President Trump went and dropped those 59 Tomahawk missiles in Syria, what did he get? From across the media, Democrats, Republicans applauded him, many saying this is the first time he's actually acted like a president.
Oh my gosh.
Brian Williams on MSNBC, I think it was, saying what a beautiful sight it was to behold. I mean, this is what's wrong. This is what's wrong. This is when we ask, how is it possible that these regime change wars have continued for so long under both parties? It is this establishment that comes from foreign policy and the media and politics that are so rooted in this twisted mindset, frankly, that is so costly and that is counter to the interests of our people and our country and people in the world.
Tulsi Gabbard's unwillingness to join in on the celebrations and to instead question, scrutinize, and investigate for herself have left the Congresswoman from the island state of Hawaii on an island of her own of sorts, demonized for not demonizing.
Carelessly throwing around this word enemy is one of the things that throughout time has been the action that precipitates a regime change war.
Yeah.
So there's kind of, if you look at it, there's somewhat of a pattern that we see where first someone is demonized, they are painted in a certain light, there are other actions taken, then they become an enemy of the United States, which then people, if they're an enemy, then of course we must go and take action against them and to go and overthrow. So when we look at these regime change wars, it's not to say that these are great people who are leading these countries, but it's to be realistic about the situation, and that even if your intent is good, the reality is that the regime change wars that we wage result in more suffering for the people in those countries, and do not serve our interests, are costly for us in every single way. I mean, the things that we're talking about, this is why I'm running for president. I've never had an ambition in my life to be president. This is not what this is about. It's not a game. This is serious. The consequences are real for continuing down this destructive path that we've been on, or changing, providing this sea change in our leadership and our foreign policy, which is what I'm seeking to do, to end these wasteful regime change wars, to bring about an end to this new Cold War and nuclear arms race, and to with this peace dividend that's created by the trillions of dollars that we're spending on these wars, that we can bring back to invest in serving the needs of people in our communities all across this country. Things like healthcare, affordable housing, education, criminal justice reform, infrastructure, protecting the environment. There are so many urgent and pressing needs that we need to address, but we cannot do this unless and until we shift our priorities in this country so that we are putting the well-being and the interests of our people and our country first. And that's what I'm seeking to do.
Tulsi hasn't quite met the donation threshold to make the debate stage. The new rules require her to collect contributions of any size from 65,000 different people in order for her anti-interventionist message to be heard.
So the first debates were just announced. They're going to be held in Miami in late June. What we need in order to get there is at least 65,000 individual contributions. We've just crossed the 50,000 mark.
All right.
So we are making progress, but we need people's help to be the fuel behind our people-powered campaign. And really, even if people are undecided, they don't know exactly who they want to support for president yet, that's fine. I think it's important if we can all stand behind the necessity of having a strong and vigorous debate about these issues that we've talked about today, then they should support bringing our voice to the debate stage. They can do that very easily.
So just donate to your campaign. Anything like a buck will do.
Tulsi2020.com. Go to Tulsi2020.com. If all you can give is $1, maybe $5, $10, whatever it is that you can afford. We need about 15,000 of you at home.
New people. So it's got, and that's what people need to understand. It's got to be individual donors.
That's right.
So it's not individual donations. That's not an amount of money. It's 65,000 people.
65,000 people. And it's going to make a big difference.
Well, the future is yet to be seen, but maybe Tulsi will be the one making that big difference.